David has been a colleague in the Department of Global Studies for the last, I guess, 2 years. Is it 2 or 3 years? I can't remember exactly. This could be the third year. It could be the second. For a relatively short amount of time, but a long time in a way, because a lot of the connections that he has with faculty members and students, the interest areas around food and food sovereignty and education and political ecology, all of those things that kind of that he's going to be talking about today in his presentation are kind of touchstones and glue really for a lot of us. So we have common ground, and some folks have worked with David even before he got to campus. So one of the things that's exciting about this presentation right today is a celebration of his new book, right? And really glad that he's here, really glad that he's publishing this amazing new book that we're going to hear some about today, and becoming kind of like a leader in the field of the political ecology of education, which I think is one of the things you're going to hear about today. A great colleague in the Department of Global Studies and in Food Studies. And we're just really glad that he's here, really glad that he's sharing his work with us in this presentation, but also in the courses, like some of you might be in his food sovereignty course now. Really important interventions and articulations. I think one of the things I most admire about David's work is the articulation that he brings from education to health to food and to empowerment and participatory research methodologies as well. Just really, really appreciate his work. I want to make sure that I recognize also the Department of Global Studies, which David is a faculty member in, and I am also as a co-sponsor of the event. It's great to be able to kind of bring together units. We've been doing that a lot in food studies over the years, and it's one of the most important parts, I think, of food connecting to different realms or different spaces on campus. I think that's my kind of introduction to the scene, setting the scene, and welcoming you, Dave, to this space to share your work with us. Very happy that you're here, grateful that you're here. Lisa, is there any other kind of stuff before we turn over the Zoom to David?
Nope, just check the chat for links for more information about food studies, and at the end we can share information about our upcoming talk in 2 weeks.
Perfect. Great. Very good. Thank you, Lisa. And I think Lisa's going to be sharing her screen, which has David's slides. For technological reasons, it seemed like a better fit. So we're going to do that. And David, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you, Lisa, for all of your help with the logistics. That was a beautifully kind introduction, Stephen. I really appreciate it. So in today's talk, I want to be exploring some of the key lessons that can be taken from my recent book, The Political Ecology of Education. Next slide, please. So this is a book that's based on approximately 2 years of fieldwork that I conducted in collaboration with activists from Brazil's landless workers movement. This is a book that I just published, came out at the end of November last year, so it's pretty new. With West Virginia University's Press's Radical Nature series. And that's a really cool new series that's highlighting a lot of great new works in political ecology, critical agrarian studies, and so forth. Next slide, please. So in today's presentation, what I'm hoping to do is to weave together the voices of Brazil's activists within a novel theoretical framework, which I term the political ecology of education. And I'm going to be mobilizing that framework to shed light on some of the most pressing questions surrounding food systems educators and activists, both in the global South and here in the global North. Now, I want to start today's presentation, as I do with the book, with a critical question that was posed to me by Isabel, a dedicated MST activist and educator pictured here. Quote, "We need to reflect on why we are no longer producing food," Isabel remarked after pouring steaming hot coffee into an old jelly jar as we sat together. Now, Isabel, like many other educators in Brazil's landless workers movement, encourages her students to critically reflect on the dominant agro-industrial system and how it structures farmers' lives in her community. Isabel believes that these critical forms of agroecological education can help her community become more food sovereign, more in control over its own food system. Now, I wanted to begin today's presentation with Isabel's critical question, as it provides a starting point to untangle the book's main themes, which are the role of critical food systems education in shaping political participation, common sense understandings of agriculture, and the landscape itself. Now, I recognize that Isabel's critical question might sit uncomfortably as it calls into question many assumptions about the realization of food sovereignty within grassroots movements. Yet it highlights what's at stake in the book, namely the survival of her community, the future of the MST itself, and the viability of sustainable agriculture in the Amazon. Next slide, please. That afternoon, Isabel painted a picture of her community in dire straits. She gestured up a street of largely abandoned houses, such as this one, and into the distance where a cattle pasture extends into the horizon. Quote, "It wasn't supposed to be this way," she told me. "No, our comrades, our brothers and sisters did not die in the struggle for this." Next slide, please. Now, I want to pause for a moment and provide a little bit of context surrounding this movement and its central struggle. Isabel and the comrades, brothers, and sisters she mentions are all part of Latin America's largest agrarian social movement, known as Brazil's Landless Workers Movement, which in Portuguese is O Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra, and goes by the acronym of MST. Now, the MST is comprised of people like Isabel from across all walks of life in Brazil. You'll have street workers, those who grew up as laborers on large family farms, family farmers who are working as tenants but have always longed for their own land, and so forth. It's a peasant movement. It's not an indigenous movement. And the MST uses direct action to challenge the highly inequitable system of land ownership in Brazil, as typified by this beautiful image from Sebastião Salgado, a Brazilian photographer. MST members occupy what they argue is unproductive land and pressure the state to take that land and to create what's known as an agrarian reform settlement. And so this beautiful image by Sebastião Salgado really captures this tactic as well as this emotion. What you have pictured here are thousands of MST activists that are literally breaking open a fence to invade land, to squat that land. And that's the tactic that they use to pressure the government to create an agrarian reform community known as a settlement. So the basic trajectory, next slide, please. So the basic trajectory that MST members follow first involves identifying a piece of land that's unproductive. And MST members will then occupy that land and set it up an encampment known as an acampamento, and that's pictured on the far left. MST members will often live in these acampamentos, these encampments, for years on end, up to a decade, I found, under black plastic tarps or thatched huts in very difficult situations, trying to hold that land, often under the threat of direct violence from hired gunmen. And they'll hold that land until they can pressure the government to create a legalized area of agrarian reform, known as a settlement or an assentamento, and that's pictured here in the center image. So the settlement is a legalized area where individuals have the right to produce, they have access to credit, they have access to healthcare and education. And once the MST is able to pressure the government to create a settlement, that's when really the space becomes transformed. The MST are able to build houses, build schools and hospitals and so forth. Now, the MST's vision is agroecological at its core. They seek to take what is often degraded and infertile land and through agroecological techniques to turn it to producing organic food for their own consumption as well as that in the broader community. And that's pictured on the far right of this slide. Next slide, please. Now, to give you a sense of the MST's distribution, this is a map of agrarian reform settlements created between 1979 and 2016. And the size of the dot on this map equals the number of settlements per municipality. So you get a sense of really the spatially extensive as well as spatially intensive nature of the MST and the ways in which it has territorialized itself throughout Brazil. So the MST started in the late 1970s or early 1980s in the south of Brazil, and from there spread into the northeast. That's the kind of upper right-hand portion of the map. From there, in the late 1980s, the movement moved into the Amazon. Next slide, please. And that's where I'm going to be talking about today. So Isabel's settlement is located in the southeastern portion of the state of Pará in Brazil's eastern Amazonian region. And the black rectangle there indicates the approximate location of the settlement. Next slide, please. Isabel lives in an agrarian reform settlement known as the 17 de Abril, which means the 17th of April. This community consists of 690 families and has a village center, which is in the center of that map. And that's a map that I created of land plot boundaries in the community. And in that village center, everyone has a house, and that's pictured on the top upper right-hand image. And it's kind of like a semi-urban area. Everyone has a house and a small kind of yard. But they also have a larger piece of land on the rural periphery. That's where you see all the land plots. And that's in that rural periphery that each farmer has approximately 50 hectares of land. Now, as Isabel mentioned, her community was the product of direct struggle. It was born out of one of Brazil's most violent agrarian conflicts. Next slide, please. On April 17th, 1996, gunmen massacred 19 rural landless workers who were occupying highway PA 150 in El Dorado dos Carajás, Pará. I frequently describe this date as having a similar place in our national consciousness as Columbine or Newtown, or, unfortunately, these massacres continue to occur. But I make that comparison in the sense that if someone were to come to the US and say that they were doing research in Columbine, you might think immediately as to they might be doing some research related to the school shooting that took place there. So very similarly, I found that in Brazil, if I mention to someone, even if I'm in the south of Brazil, that I work in El Dorado dos Carajás, they instantly know what happened in that community, in that space. Because this was a pivotal moment in Brazil's political history and in the struggle for agrarian reform. Following the massacre of these 19 MST activists by paramilitaries and hired gunmen, the government was under intense domestic and international pressure to create an agrarian reform settlement for the survivors. So pictured here in the center, the black and white image, is another image by Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado of coffins of these MST members at a public service that followed the massacre. And then here at the top and the bottom of the slide are archival images that I collected from the era of the settlement's creation. That's the lower image when they were just building the houses, and high agricultural yields, bumper crops of corn following the settlement's creation. Now, among those who gained access to land following the massacre were Isabel's father and approximately 2,000 other MST members. Now, 19 activists sacrificed their lives for a dream on that day. But as Isabel mentioned at the outset, this was not a vision of abandoned houses and degraded cattle pasture. Rather, their aspiration was for land to live on and land to farm. Next slide, please. But Isabel was particularly dismayed that day by the current state of agricultural production in her settlement and how far her community had moved from its founding vision of food sovereignty. Isabel's father originally joined the movement to get access to land and engage in small-scale subsistence agriculture. Yet since the founding of the settlement 2 decades ago, he and most community members had transitioned from subsistence crops to export-oriented dairy production. And that was a development that didn't sit well with Isabel, who told me, quote, "What you have here are essentially mini fazendas, large farms with tons of cattle. You won't find a single lemon tree or a banana tree or any pineapple. No, it's just cattle, just pasture." End quote. What Isabel was lamenting was the disjuncture between the settlement's reality and the movement's model of food sovereignty. Next slide, please. The MST holds what I think of as an agroecological vision for its settlements. Land should be used, theoretically at least, for small-scale, diversified peasant agriculture, should involve no pesticides or genetically modified organisms, and should contribute directly and significantly to the subsistence of the household. Now, the MST legitimizes its land occupations by arguing that its members will take unproductive land and make it fruitful, replacing environmentally damaging forms of production with more ecologically benign practices, such as cacao agroforestry, pictured here. That's the farming of chocolate. Okay, next slide, please. However, for Isabel and many others, the settlement was at an existential crossroads. In a resigned tone, Isabel told me, quote, "The 17 de Abril, it's lost its identity, its sense of purpose. Today, there's no more unity. Compañeros don't have any unity anymore. People are called together to do something collectively, and few people agree to do it," end quote. Raising her shoulders and putting up her hands in a sign of bewilderment, she asked me, "Where is the struggle? Where is the movement?" The answer was, quote, "It's over." Spaces that have been carved out by and for the movement, such as the Che Guevara Cultural Center pictured here, have been largely abandoned and serve as dismal reminders of an alternate future. Next slide, please. Yet Isabel knows that her critical assessment of the state of food sovereignty in her community and the dynamics of political participation within it are not a foregone conclusion. She and other educators, such as Luzineja pictured here, are introducing critical visions of agroecology to their students. These educators are on the front lines, I would argue, of a broad struggle for the future of not just the 17 de Abril or the long-term political viability of the MST, but of sustainable agriculture in the rural Amazon. Isabel Luzineja and a handful of other educators whose voices I want to lift up today understand that contemporary rural education has a role to play in agrarian change. As they described it, the state education system implicitly devalues rural areas and livelihoods while valorizing urban ones. Education, from their perspective, considered as a driver of agrarian change, pushing youth from rural areas to urban ones. Education can propel what scholars term depeasantization. However, what Isabel and other teachers within the settlement are trying to usher in is a new vision of education, which colleagues and I have termed critical food systems education. And that's a form of education that seeks to increase nascent processes of repeasantization, improving the sustainability of family farmers' livelihoods and connections to the land. Next slide, please. So the book's overarching theoretical framework is what I term the political ecology of education. And this is a perspective that colleagues and I have developed to analyze the interconnections between pedagogical processes, political economy, and narratives and processes of environmental change. And to summarize what's a fairly lengthy theoretical discussion in the introduction, I'll here define the political ecology of education as a perspective attuned to how the distribution of power and resources among connected political entities in related places mediates pedagogical practices from tacit to formal learning and related knowledge systems, structuring access and control to natural resources, interactions with the landscape, and conceptions of nature-society relationships. Next slide, please. I draw upon this framework to look at several larger theoretical questions in the book, and I just want to touch on one of them at this moment, and that's surrounding the connections between decolonization, education, and agroecology. Now, I argue that decolonization is necessary to create an educational system that advances agroecology, peasant culture, and sustainable livelihoods. Herein, I define decolonization as a dually material and epistemological process through which historically marginalized groups deconstruct colonial systems of knowledge and land access and rebuild sovereignty over knowing, being, and engaging with the natural world. Next slide, please. I base this definition upon my broader reading of what's termed the decolonial turn, which is not a single theoretical school, social movement, or identity group, but rather a constellation of views that understand coloniality as an ongoing problem in the modern era and decolonization and decoloniality as unfinished processes. More specifically, my analysis of decolonization is explicitly grounded in an extensive corpus of scholarship that has and continues to emerge through what's known as the Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality Project. This largely Latin American initiative argues that non-Eurocentric forms of knowing and being emanating from indigenous, peasant, and other groups on the periphery are powerful alternatives to the ecologically destructive forces of colonial modernity. Now, I recognize that my usage of decolonization is both similar to and very different from many indigenous perspectives, particularly here in North America. And I have a fairly lengthy section of the book where I spell out those similarities and differences, and I'm more than happy in the Q&A section following this talk to explore those zones of convergence and divergence. Next slide, please. I wanted just to take a moment to reflect on my positionality within the movement and how that impacts the research process. So the process of working with the MST has been one of constant self-reflection and negotiation. For me, as a scholar interested in agroecology's capacity to help achieve food sovereignty, I was very conscious about not allowing my political and ideological leanings to lead to proposing particular actions. I found that, in fact, my positionality was a source of confusion and debate within the community. For some activists, my purpose was ultimately to help advance community development through bringing projects, literally agricultural credit, into the community. These discussions I found challenging in that they called me to question my role within the community and the ways in which I was either engaged with or not in advancing their struggles. Informed by the MST's vision, my objective was not to quote unquote bring development, but rather to help shine a light on what Marais and Witzel, two activist scholars from within the movement, refer to as the conflicts and contradictions of our reality. And I'll just note that since conducting this research, I've become an active member of the National Coordinating Council of the Friends of the MST, which is an international solidarity organization that supports the MST. And we've engaged over the years in a number of projects, including bringing MST leaders to the US to intern and partner with food justice organizations and sending leaders from food justice organizations in the US to Brazil to learn from the MST as part of a broader transnational learning network. Next slide, please. All right, so this research is what we might think of as a multi-sited ethnography. I was interested in focusing on sites of agroecological knowledge production, looking particularly, it's an ethnography of the Disjuncture, but it understands agroecological knowledge production in a networked fashion. And I explore how the knowledge that's produced, consumed, circulated, and put into practice in the Disjuncture is actually produced in a host of other sites throughout the region. So what you should see now is a slide that has three circular images on it. The first site that I want to talk about is the Agroecological Institute of Latin America, or IALA, Amazonia. And this is a non-formal agroecological education center that's part of La Via Campesina's network of more than 50 different agroecological schools. La Via Campesina is the transnational agrarian social movement that the MST is a key member of. Next slide, please. The second space that I conducted research in was the Federal University of Pará. This is located in the city of Marabá, about 2 hours from the Disjuncture. And these two sites were intricately interconnected. During the time of my research, the MST had partnered with the Federal University of Pará to create a graduate certificate program in agroecology. So it would be like if you were doing a master's program and everyone in your master's program was an MST activist. So this was a social movement cohort. And it was a cohort that spent its time broken up between at the Federal University in classrooms and then at this social movement non-formal learning space, the IALA Amazonia. Next slide, please. The third space that I'll talk about briefly in this presentation is the Federal Institute of Pará, or the EFPA, and this is located in another MST settlement known as the 26 de Marzo. And this space was critically important because it was where there was a high school program focused on agroecology. And so high school students from the Disjuncture were going there to participate in that agroecology program. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a multi-sited ethnography. It draws on approximately 17 months of in-depth field work. As part of this process, I conducted drew upon a variety of anthropological and geographical techniques, including semi-structured interviews, a large-scale community survey, and spatial methods. Next slide, please. I want to now move into exploring some of the thematic results of the research that I talk about in the book. And one of the main theories that I draw upon the book is the idea of the social production of space. And that's literally drawing upon French Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre's conceptualizations of the ways in which capital shapes space. Now, compounding the shared history of explicit violence was one that was reproduced through state policies and projects after people got access to the land. And this is what MST members refer to as the era of the Cala Boca projects, or the shut your mouth projects. So once the settlement was created, there was this massive influx of agricultural credit that the settlement's cooperative association took out, these loans, millions of dollars of credit. But they were credit for specific types of projects that were created in the South in Sao Paulo and then literally projected onto the landscape. So you had a rice processing facility, a manioc processing facility, a dairy, commercial dairy. But there was no infrastructure in the community at this point. There was no roads, there was no electricity. And so all of these projects were destined to fail. Millions of dollars worth of equipment basically just became embodied into the landscape as the landscape grew up through these buildings. And so this is what I explore in the book as an example of the structural violence of development, or development as debt, because the settlement's cooperative association was never able to repay these loans. And because they were never able to repay these loans, they were never able to take out new loans for projects to advance agricultural production in the community. And so everyone has basically remained what they term sujo, or dirty, in the eyes of the bank. Next slide, please. So that was just an example of the social production of the spatial, or the ways in which capital structures the social spatiality of life. I want to now flip that lens on its head and look at the spatial production of the social. So while the state's development projects undoubtedly crippled any possibility of food sovereignty within the community, what I want to now talk about is a much longer history of violence that was already etched onto that landscape. So the image here is a composite of historical aerial photographs that were actually flown by the US Air Force over Brazil in the early 1960s, when the US was concerned that Brazil was going to become a communist power. And the process through which I uncovered these archival images is really fascinating. I'd be happy to talk about it in the QA, and involved going to like 10 different archives throughout Brazil and ultimately finding them in cardboard boxes in the bottom of a basement somewhere. But pictured here, this white outline is the outline of the 16 de Abril of the contemporary settlement in the early 1960s. And I've colored these areas light gray, which were already deforested. If you were to remove that coloring, you would see airport runways in the Amazon. And so what this image shows is that the promised land that the settlers had received in the late 1990s, it had long been deforested and used as a space for intensive cattle production. Next slide, please. We see the continuity of this history of land use when we scale out temporarily. So above are a series of supervised classified images from the Landsat system, and black in these images is forest cover, and gray is deforested land. Now remember that the settlement was created in 1996. And so what you might notice in looking at these images, or these sets of images, is that by 1996, approximately 75% of the land had already been deforested, degraded, and used for intensive cattle farming. And it was not just swidden agriculture, small-scale deforestation, but rather large-scale mechanized transformation of the landscape. So in the 1992 to 1996 image, for example, you see the spatial artifacts of anthropogenic landscape change, namely bulldozers. think it's also important to note that there's a reverse trend that's happening. If you look in the 2000 to 2009 images, the upper left-hand corner, and compare those with the 1996 image, you'll notice processes of reforestation taking place. Okay, next slide, please. So that was an exploration of the intertwined spatial production of the social and the social production of the spatial, or how it is that the landscape and the history of the landscape has constrained food sovereignty within the community. I want to now turn to offer two super brief ethnographic vignettes for more focused exploration of how the MST is mobilizing education. And this some activists refer to as breaking down the fences around knowledge. Next slide, please. So this first case study is from the Federal University, Unifespa, and this was a space in which the MST had formed tactical partnerships with the university beginning in the early 1990s. They set up these partnerships in order to create ultimately an intentional scaffolding of courses ranging from kindergarten through grade school, through high school, to graduate school. And so they now have this whole host of courses that MST activists are able to move through. As Adolfo, an educator in the graduate program that I was researching, told me the first step in developing these programs was to remove the perspective of Western knowledge, the hierarchy of Western knowledge. He told me, quote, "We need to not debase the knowledge that's produced through experience. Don't minimize the importance of struggles as forms of knowledge production and pedagogical invention." He told me we need to emphasize that knowledge is not created from a distance, but instead is produced through dialogue, through the intentionality of various subjects, through informal knowledge, which has its own history. And as a first principle, we call this intercontinental, or interknowledge. The idea that a course isn't just the location for the development of academic knowledge, but a place for the convergence of experience. And so I found that one of the ways in which the MST is decolonized in the university is through debates, through courses, through public lectures such as this one. Next slide, please. So as Adolfo concluded, in the way that you're bringing all this in, there's no way that the university can turn its back on it. In the way that you're building all of these courses, you're opening all of these spaces for debate, you're making valuable and visible forms of subaltern knowledge, you're transforming the university from within, and there's no way we can go back. Okay, next slide, please. So the second case study that I just want to really briefly highlight is from the IFPA, the Federal Institute of Pará. And the first case study I should have noted before I began was a case study in how of the relations between decolonization and land, whereby decolonizing education, decolonizing knowledge results in the advancement of the decolonization of land. By decolonizing the university, you're building a movement that will advance the decolonization of land. So that's the first case study, is one optic on the interrelationships between decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing land. The second case study flips that lens on its head and looks at how decolonizing land advances a process of decolonizing knowledge. So this case study takes place in the MST's 26 de Março settlement, the 26th of March, which is about an hour and a half away from the 17 de Abril. And this settlement is the process, this school is the process of decolonizing land. So in 2004, INCRA, which is the National Institute of Colonization and Agrarian Reform, created the 26 de Março settlement from the Fazenda Cabaceiras, which had been owned by the Almeida family. They're one of the most powerful and feared families in that region of the Amazon. Now, the Almeida's principal activity in the Fazenda Cabaceiras was the extraction of Brazil nuts, which they sold to international markets. What the Almeidas were doing was contracting migrant workers from other states under the promise of good housing, fair pay, and safe working conditions, and then using hired gunmen to prevent the migrant castañeros from escaping. Between 1982 and 2004, these gunmen murdered 40 migrant workers, burying them in unmarked graves on what's currently this school's land. After decades of illegal activity in 2004, INCRA, the federal government, finally managed to put a stop to this violence. The state expropriated the land and created the MSTs Vinci-Sesta Marso settlement. The community then took a 354-hectare section of that land and allocated it to create the Federal Institute. And this is an institute, it's basically a high school that focuses on agroecology. All of the curriculum is around agroecology, but it's very practical. Most of the school's grounds are devoted to a number of different field research sites where students are engaged in their own critical place-based field of research. So in the book, I have a much more lengthy exploration of this institute. And the key argument here is that this institute is a manifestation of the decolonization of land. It's an institute that really lifts up subaltern forms of knowledge production and subaltern identities. And it's an educational space that was only made possible by first decolonizing land. Next slide, please. So I just want to really briefly summarize these two relationships that I've talked about, the interrelationships between the decolonization of land and that of knowledge. As I explore them, decolonizing land and decolonizing knowledge are mutually constitutive, bidirectional. Breaking up land can provide the impetus to decolonize education, as we just saw in the example of the Vinci-Sesta Marso settlement. However, decolonial pedagogies can also transform relations to the land, and that's what we saw briefly in the example from the Federal University. So decolonization in this context is both an epistemological and a political process. It challenges the primacy of academic knowledge. It's based in the experience of social struggle, of social movements, and their forms of critical territorial consciousness. Next slide, please. So I wanted to end the presentation, as I do the book, with the critical question that was posed to me by Isabel, that dedicated MST activist and educator. Isabel's question about the loss of food sovereignty within the MSTs Decolonization is undoubtedly a thorny one. And as I've endeavored to show today, answering it requires that two optics must be kept in parallel. First, we have the spatial production of the social, and second, the social production of the spatial. Now, neither approach by itself is sufficient to explicate processes of agrarian transformation that are taking place in the Decolonization. While the history of the landscape is a driving force shaping present land management options, so too are the embodied cultural traditions and spatial imaginaries of the settlement's inhabitants. Next slide, please. Rather, it was through conversations with Isabel, participation in road blockades, and exploring together what unifies the movement's diverse educational opportunities that I recognized that food systems education is an emerging tool to reshape agrarian relations and the permanence of the peasantry on the land. What Isabel and other activists helped me to see is that food systems education, when reimagined from the grassroots, looks very different from what many of us will be familiar with. For sure, there are raised beds in gardens, at schools, similar to what we might find here in Eugene. But they have a different function. Their function is to educate for food sovereignty. Now, throughout the book, I've described this approach as critical food systems education. And what distinguishes this vision of education is its goal of food sovereignty, which is characterized by autonomous systems of production based around workers' rights, cooperative values, and ecological techniques. This approach is critical because it moves beyond traditional forms of knowledge production that are based in monologue and deconstructs the effects of agricultural knowledge and technology in shaping both peasant production systems and the landscape itself. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to end with this presentation with Isabel because it might seem that the story of the Decolonization by this point is anything but a happy one. Born from Brazil's most violent massacre of landless workers, the settlement's history has been, by many accounts, including those of its own inhabitants, a series of failures. Yet for every contradiction, there are moments, perhaps even incipient patterns of resistance. And that's what I'd like to conclude with, is a brief ethnographic portrait of one of these reverse trends, focusing on the development of new encampments by the settlement's youth. So when I returned in 2015 to conduct follow-up research, Isabel had moved to an encampment. She'd moved to an encampment because it was a fresh territory where the energy and the commitment to social change remained palpable. As she told me, quote, "The encampment is full of possibilities." Isabel decided that her capacity to affect long-standing social transformation, to actualize the potential of her own political formation, to pay back her investment to the movement, all of that needed to take place in the encampment. Isabel understood that her potential to plant the seed of political sustainability, it was grounded in her own history of political formation. She told me, quote, "I can take my 14 years of experience of struggle within the social movement and worked with the encamped community on this. Everything that I've studied, everything that I've learned, everything that I know, I can use to help make a difference for them. And I feel really satisfied with myself," she went on. "I feel very happy. My life is complete here. I spend the entire day knowing that in terms of my activism, I've returned to my militancy, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. I returned to this question of being in direct dialogue with the people that are so close to my community, and I'm helping many people. And as a result, I feel very positive. For example, in terms of the school, we're working with the question of what does it mean to advance food sovereignty, to advance agroecology, and this has left me very happy." So throughout my presentation today, I've made a case for critical food systems education, having the potential to stem depeasantization and through political formation lead to processes of repeasantization. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that perhaps that's no longer possible in the DCC Jabril itself. Perhaps, as Isabel suggested, that essence has been lost. But that does not mean that the movement's vision or its efforts to transform the education system is a failure. And this is what I'd like to leave you with. Perhaps they're working exactly as intended. Perhaps, in Isabel's words, the struggle is not over. Isabel has been formed and is drawing upon her political formation to plant the seed for political sustainability, for the long-term political, agroecological, and organizational sustainability of the movement itself. Isabel's perspective forces a radical rethinking of how the success or the failure of grassroots social movements and their vision of critical food systems education is evaluated. Next slide. So I'd just like to say obrigado, which is thank you. And then one more slide. Thank the funders who were gracious enough to support this research. And then last slide, open it up for questions. And thank you so much, Lisa, for helping to manage the logistics there.
Terrific presentation, really theoretically compelling and engaging, and also really humanistic, also kind of at multiple levels, really great. I think what we're going to do is have people raise their hands using the function on the Zoom window. And then I think Lisa is going to try to call on people. So give some thought to questions or comments you might want to offer for David. And we have, I think we have about 15 minutes or so. So we have a good chunk of time for a conversation. And thank you, David, for keeping that space. So go ahead and use your function there to raise your hand, and we'll call on you, and you can ask questions. Then I'll keep track of the time when we get closer to 1.
Folks are also welcome to put their questions in the chat if you're unable to raise your hand. Samantha, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I enjoyed it. I had 2 different questions. One of them was related to the first case study you brought up at the end, talking about the different types of like education and pedagogy. And I was wondering if it felt very reminiscent to kind of Paulo Freire's co-intentional education versus banking education. And I was wondering if that's where they were drawing inspiration, or if there was someone else that they were using as a model. And then I was curious to hear more about your conceptualizations of coloniality and decolonization and kind of how you balance these different compromises between the different interpretations.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha. Yeah, so the MST is very, draws very heavily on Paulo Freire in a number of ways. For, central ideas for Freire in terms of like critical consciousness and praxis are at the core of the MST's pedagogy. And I talk about this in the book in terms of the idea of like critical territorial consciousness and how many of the MST's educational programs, they're based in around essentially field research, where students go out into their community and they're instructed by their professors to kind of research the contradictions of their reality, and so research these competing systems of land production. And this is honestly, just as a footnote, one of the places where I think we as activists and educators in a global North context can draw on examples from the MST, thinking about how, for example, we can take our students out to the field, but not just to kind of visit farms and so forth, but to research competing spaces of production, which is something that the MST does, where they'll go and they'll visit large scale, CAFOs one week, where they'll visit, industrial bauxite mines, and then the next week they'll look at small scale agroecological cattle production, those kind of competing spaces of production. So in addition to Paulo Freire, the MST, has a very robust theoretical framework for how it envisions pedagogy. And I'd love to circulate some publications where I and other scholars have discussed this. But they draw on a number of Russian pedagogues as well, early 20th century Soviet pedagogues. Anton Makarenko and Moisey Pristak are two of the main ones. Makarenko was known for working with orphan children and basically having orphan children organize themselves collectively to take care of their schools. And this is something that the MST does, where they have students organize themselves into what they term nucleus de base, or base nuclei, or these like self-organized collectives that run the schools. And then Moisey Pristak, another Soviet pedagogue, is known for his work on the pedagogical importance of labor. And that's something that MST is also very involved with. In terms of decolonization and coloniality, it's really a nettle of kind of relations. One of I think the primary kind of pieces to work through is that decolonization in the North American context. Many activists have argued that concept can only be used by and in relation to indigenous communities, that it doesn't make sense to talk about decolonization in the context of labor movements. It doesn't make sense to talk about decolonization in the context of peasant movements, for example. This is Tuck and Yang, one of their kind of pivotal pieces on decolonization. And what I argue in the book is that is true, but we need to remember that these movements, and Latin American scholars and allies in addition, are using these concepts, and they're using them in very particular ways, and which is not to kind of eclipse and negate how North American indigenous groups and allies are using the concepts, but rather remember that there are alternative conceptualizations of them. And so that's really what I'm drawing on here, is this MCD project, the Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality project. And that really looks at least how I understand it, in terms of the geopolitics of knowledge and how knowledge has been historically produced in centers of colonial power and then projected onto the landscape along with political economic financing that supported those forms of knowledge production. So decolonization, as I explored in this book, is really reworking those systems of knowledge production, those value systems, but it's also to kind of come back to Frantz Fanon. It's about unworking, decolonizing, undoing those colonial structures in the mind and the heart itself. And I think that's really the critical piece here. And that's the piece where there's really a space of convergence between North American perspectives on decolonization and those from countries like Brazil. Because I would argue, I would argue that both of these groups are doing is they're conceiving of decolonization as a process of undoing these mental models, these mental frames that have been really solidified through the process of colonization. And so decolonization is a process of lifting up these subaltern visions and ways of being and knowing. Yeah.
Masterful answer. Beautifully done.
Oh, thank you, Stephen.
Next question.
I'll just note before someone else jumps in that it's a pleasure to see you all in the audience. And I feel like we've got three or four generations of my food sovereignty class here, which is great to see. So thank you all for coming today.
Tai has a question. I have a question. I can't raise my hand. It says, go ahead and write it down there if you want, or just say it. Go for it.
Hi, yeah. So I have a question. You mentioned briefly the idea of rural and urban areas and where the encampments and settlements fit in. So I'm curious what your experience of the settlements was in terms of how these critical food systems can engage more intensely urban areas where material access or territorial access to some of these resources is limited.
It's a great question, Tai. I mean, the relations between urban and rural space are really complicated here in the U.S. as well, right? As well, you know, anywhere I would argue, honestly, in the world. In the media, there is really a narrative of the MST as that's very negative. That folks are thieves, you know, they're stealing land that rightfully belongs to other people, and so forth. And so you see that kind of idea and that ideology in urban areas in which the MST are very proximate to. So I think there's a lot of kind of broader, if we want to think about the work of like Antonio Gramsci, early 20th century Italian political theorist, who I draw upon a lot in the book about how do we achieve broader social transformation. One of the things that Gramsci argues is that like real revolution will only happen through the advancement of a new form of common sense, that we need to kind of work through this process of what he terms the war of position, of critical consciousness raising. And so I think that's what the MST really is trying to do and needs to continue to do in urban spaces, which is challenging and transforming urban consciousness about the relations between urban and rural space. I think it can happen through things that are as simple as farmers markets to some degree. You know, you have MST activists coming to the local farmers markets in urban areas, wearing their MST shirts, being proud of the fact that they are producing healthy organic food that's affordable. I think that's part of a process, a slow process of making visible social change. But I think it's a difficult process that, you know, is ongoing. Municipal schools, they continue to valorize urban life and to denigrate the MST and rural livelihoods. And so this is, I mean, to come back to Gramsci, like an ongoing war of position. It's a long-term social struggle that needs to take place on various fronts.
I think Momo, did you have your hand up there?
I did. I know we're running short on time, so I'm happy to let everyone go. I don't want to, it's a big question about building trust with communities and reciprocity as, you know, positionality as a researcher from the global north and all that. But that's a huge question. So if we don't have time, I'm happy to email you and keep the conversation going.
It's one of the difficult things about this is the time that, you know, and I think we're all kind of hungry for this community and connection too, and conversation. So I'm sorry about the time crunch about it, but I do want to underscore in the chat, there's a link to David's stuff for people who already know him and to get in touch with him. You know how to do that. And for other folks who don't know him, who want to know him more, as you can tell, he's very open to engaging with people and wanting to engage with people. So I want to sure that we kind of highlight that. Let's see, it's 12:57 now. Do you want to do a little bit with that, David?
Yeah, and thank you, Stephen. I'll also just note that, like, for sure. Folks, feel free to reach out to me by email if you want to continue this conversation. Also, if like what I talked about today was interesting, I strongly encourage you to check out my food sovereignty class. There's both a web and a live version of it that hopefully will be back in live modality next year. But my well-being class as well is really interesting along these lines and looks at the interconnection between health, food systems, education, and the environment. So if you've got space in your schedule, join us for that conversation. Momo, great to see you, and thank you for that. That is a big question, no doubt, in terms of like questions of positionality and trust. Starting points include that I'm part of the Scholars Collective within the FMS, within the Friends of the MST, which is a group of individuals that the MST has basically asked us to kind of vet proposals. So researchers will come. It used to be that researchers would just show up and do work with the movement, and that does still happen to some degree because you can't control everything. But ideally, the process basically is that like researchers come to us. We interview them. We try to get a sense of who they are as individuals and their political commitments, whether they actually have a vision of supporting the movement or whether they're simply trying to be critical and not like engaged in the struggle. And if they kind of move through step one, then we kind of pass them on to the MST's international relations sector, which is responsible for coordinating these sorts of projects. But what the MST has really asked is that they're not interested in folks researching them anymore. That that's been done, and also it's important to note that it continues to be done by a number of MST activists who have become trained in graduate school. Right, the MST has sent thousands of its members to graduate school. They're doing their own research on and with the movement. So what the MST has really asked for is if folks are interested in doing work on the MST, instead support the struggle by researching the enemy. They want people to kind of be working within Monsanto, working within Syngenta, studying up, doing kind of analyses of land grabs in Brazil, generating new knowledge that can really be fed directly into the movement itself. And so that's what we try to, on the Scholars Collective, keep in mind, like someone might have a really good proposal, they might have really good personal politics and so forth. They might be an activist, but are they really kind of addressing what the MST wants to see happen? Often they're not. There have been some really great examples of folks doing work along the lines of what the MST has suggested. So Gustavo Oliveira, who's a faculty member in global studies at, I want to say UCSC, or it might be Riverside, I can't remember which one. He studied Brazilian-Chinese linkages in agribusiness and how like land grabs in Brazil were a function of Chinese agro-industrial capitalism. So that was something that really spoke to the needs as articulated by the MST. But yeah, as you noted, that it is a big question with lots to think through, and yeah, we should continue that.
You pointed out some very important pieces there, and you've covered a lot in the short amount of time that we've had together, and points us all to the book, to get more into the analysis and the connections that you're describing there. I'm super grateful for your contribution today and in general, and the work that you do, and the spirited nature of the work, the intellectual dimensions, but also the kind of deep devotion to the work that you're really clearly showing. It's a good model for all of us. And I want to just highlight, in a couple of weeks, we're having a different talk, food studies talk, that's coming up that Lisa put in the chat. It's by Dr. Emily Contois, and its interesting title, her new book, is called Dinners, Diners, Dudes, and Diets. And it's about gender and food dynamics in media. And she's really an impressive person working on some really exciting stuff that's going to bring us into conversation with a co-sponsor, Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies, as a co-sponsor for that talk. So I encourage you to go back and get some more food for thought in a couple of weeks. Thank you, David. Let's give David a round of applause, a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for your contribution today, David.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Pleasure, y'all. Wishing you all just a beautiful rest of your day.